This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 78. How practicable is a debt jubilee?
Welcome again. It's the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. And Steve Keen has often spoke about the need for a debt jubilee. If we can write off debt and then people bog down with it, we'll start spending again, boosting the economy rather than leading the economy to a cliff edge where asset prices crash because people stop spending, demand falls, and it all looks pretty sick. Remember 2008? Only more so. So what would a debt jubilee look like? And is it just theory? Or could it work? So, Steve, I mean, there's many people who talk of debt jubilees for third world countries. If we look at Greece, for example, and we're talking government debt here, sovereign debt. If we look at Greece, for example, not quite a third world country yet, but sovereign debt's so high that the bailout money that's paid to Greece is largely used to pay for their interest payments. So they're no better off. And so that debt will still have to be paid at some point. So I know your idea of a debt jubilee relates to household debt, but should we have a debt jubilee for sovereign debt too?
Well, the whole question of what sovereign debt is part of the issue here, because you get absolute panic material. The only stuff I see more panic material about government debt is Russia interfering in our elections, which they both drive me equally up the wall reading them. But this one on government debt, government debt is just the other side of a ledger that the government maintains when it creates money. And in this sense, it's the difficult part to get through to people is that government debt, when it's issued by when a country has its own currency, particularly also when it has either a balanced trade position or a trade surplus, that money creation is hang on. I get so tired of having to explain this one because to me it's becoming like sucking eggs, and you feel like you're talking to your grandmother all the damn time about how to do something, but your grandmother actually doesn't know how to suck eggs, so you've got to keep on doing it. But the basic point is that if the government wants to spend, then it has two sources of revenue for that. First of all, it has taxes. Otherwise, it has bonds it issues if its spending exceeds its taxes. Now, if its spending exceeds its taxes, it issues bonds, which are then treasury bonds, which are then sold to the private sector. Now, if you and I were going to do something similar to finance a deficit we had, we couldn't spend money to what actually sold the bonds. But in the government case, once the Parliament has passed the bill that allows those bonds to be issued, then the central bank treats the government as having the money already, which it does because what we know, even though you've got the argument about the central bank sometimes being privately owned, which was the case for the Federal Reserve, still apparently is. The Bank of England was privately owned until I think pretty close to the Second World War. But they're government institutions. They answer to the government. And as soon as the government says we've got the bills passed, then the central bank treats them as having the money in the treasury account of the central bank that they can spend. So that's one big difference between you and me.
But you are talking about a situation in the first world. In the third world, it's very different, isn't it? Where you've got countries in Africa where most of their debt is debt, whether it's funded by bank loans or bonds that are issued. I mean, it's all going in foreign money because they don't have
That's the problem. I mean, it comes back to the issue of whether you have the money or not. I've had the money. So are you talking about debts in your own currency or debts in a foreign currency?
Right.
If you're talking debts in a foreign currency, it's absolutely different because Zimbabwe can't produce American dollars. If it could, its problems would be over. But because it has to buy goods from overseas and is running a huge trade, I presume Zimbabwe is running a trade deficit. With that trade deficit, then you have to buy foreign currency to be able to purchase those goods, which you can't cover by your exports because your imports exceed your exports.
Right.
That's the basic problem. So in that case, when you want a jubilee, you're saying you're writing off debt they owe in a different currency.
Yeah.
So that's of course what Ann Pettifor organised back in 2000.
So so when you talk about a debt jubilee to most people, that's what they think of. They think of helping out third world countries. The issue, of course, is if you've got a third world country which is running in debt, all you're doing is sort of like helping with a short term solution. That debt obviously is just going to rack up again. You're sort of like taking them back to the start, but the problem that created it still exists. And I'm just wondering whether if that, so you've got to fix the issue. I'm just wondering if you do the same thing with house household debt and start issuing a debt jubilee, are you going to hit the same problem? You're not fixing the problem. All you're doing is taking people back to the beginning again.
Well, that would be the case if you didn't do other changes to the financial system. So the level of private debt that's been based in mortgages is astronomical, as we both know, and particularly in countries like Australia and Canada, where it's about 120, where household is about 120% of GDP. You've got an enormous level of debt in the household sector. And if you just simply said, let's cut that down to, say, 60%, and then didn't make any changes, the banks would be out there lending again tomorrow for household purchases, and you'd have another house price bubble. So you have to do stuff which changes the nature of the financial system, because the difficult thing that people are still getting their heads around is that we're starting to understand in general that money's created by double entry bookkeeping. It isn't a case of banks lending out money, you deposit with them. They create the money when they create the loan. In that situation, it's the creation of money that causes the bubble. And that whole dynamic would lead you back into the same old bubble situation again. You get positive feedback between the amount of money lent and the level of house prices. Right. So the increasing amount of money means an increasing level of house prices. So you simply don't want to have what has actually happened in Ireland. Again, I was quite stunned when I was there to see that there's another housing bubble starting 5 years after housing prices fell 50%. So it's obvious that just reducing the level of household debt, whether you do it by deliberate policy or by bankruptcy, and as was the case in a lot of Ireland, if you don't change the financial system, we'll be back in the same problem in 5 years' time.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, we've talked about it in the past, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again. So let's look at the idea of a debt jubilee and how it will work. And first of all, how necessary is it? So we often get back to the Great Depression and how we got out of that. And that wasn't a debt jubilee, was it? It was the government spending big on armaments. It was lots of people, full employment. If you send everyone out to war, everyone's got a job. That's a marvelous thing. And then people weren't spending much because there wasn't very much they could buy. So we sort of eased our way out of that situation without a debt jubilee, didn't we?
We did, and there was certainly parts of it that were a bit like a debt jubilee, and I still haven't done the research I want to do on the bank holiday that Roosevelt enforced during the Great Depression. But that bank holiday ended up with lots and lots of banks being consolidated, lots and lots of debt being marked off of bad debt and written off, and that was a particular contribution to reversing the trend that was started at the beginning of the Depression, because you had people paying off their debt and going bankrupt at quite an astronomical rate. So the rate of decline of debt was in nominal terms was falling at about 10% per annum, but GDP was falling at about 20 to 25% per annum. And there's a feedback between the two, because if you, and this is what Irving Fisher realized when he wrote the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions, if you pay off your debts, what that means is you take money you have in a bank account and you hand it over to the bank. So the bank's liabilities, which your deposits fall, your debt falls at the same time, but the fall in the bank liabilities is a fall in the amount of money in the economy. So there's less money. Yeah. Secondly, because you're in a crisis, as they obviously were back in the Great Depression, anybody who had money is being extremely frugal. So the velocity of money fell at the same time. So you had negative money creation and you had falling velocity. And that's why, even though debts were being paid down in nominal terms, GDP was falling faster again. Now,
and prices would be falling, presumably, in that situation too.
Pardon? Sorry?
You'd have deflation. You'd have prices falling as well.
Oh, yeah. Prices were falling by 10 to 13% per annum for the first couple of years of the Great Depression, which was fabulous for anybody who had a job, of course, because their wages, even though wages were falling, they weren't falling as fast as prices. So like in my personal case, my mother's father was a post office manager in Australia, and he had a job all the way through the Great Depression, and my family was quite comfortable during that period, because even though his wages were falling, they weren't falling as fast as prices were, and I don't believe they had any debt. So they did very nicely. So that's but the negative for people, of course, is falling prices, falling value of companies, bankruptcy, firms being unable to pay their debts, chain reactions, et cetera, et cetera. But that started coming to an end in about 1933. And part of it, I think, was the bank holiday that Roosevelt imposed. That settled the process for a while. You had a period from about 1932-33 to about 36 when the ratio of private debt was falling, but the actual nominal stock of debt wasn't. So the amount of money in circulation was constant, partly rising because of the scale of the the New Deal. And the New Deal, even though it was it's still a big deal, big enough for us to talk about it, 80 years later, the New Deal resulted in a government deficit of 5% of GDP at its maximum, which is trivial compared to what we've experienced after the financial crisis in 2008. Then Roosevelt got persuaded to rebalance the budget. Bang, back to private sector deleveraging again. GDP fell once more. Unemployment rose from 11% to 20%. And then the build up to the Second World War began. And of course, that was initially England purchasing the cash and carry scheme from America, as they were worried about the rise in military power of Nazi Germany. But the Second World War itself was an enormous stimulus, and that's what really reduced the private debt level, certainly in America. And it went from, I actually haven't got the figures in front of me, which is a mistake, but the level of debt went from something of the order of 60 or 70% of GDP, it's private debt, to about 30%, which was not quite the lowest America's ever had, but very, very low. So our debt jubilee after the Great Depression was the Second World War.
Although not as such not a jubilee as in the strict sense of the word, but and I'm just wondering if there are examples of where wholesale debt, household debt has been written off anywhere in the world in history.
In history, it has, because the whole idea of jubilees began back in the Sumerian times. And here, Michael Hudson's the guy we should have in, Michael Hudson and Cornelia Wunsch, if we get her on the radio. They're the experts on that. And the basic logic back then was that when you fell into debt, it was mainly because of the failure of crops. And the result of going into debt was you become a debt slave. You'd then work on the property of the moneylender. And as that continued to happen, the Sumerians basically understood that you had exponential increase in debt given compound interest, but only a sort of S-shaped, what's called a logistic curve increase in productivity of the land if you invested any cow dung on the land. And as the number of debt slaves rose, the number of potential freemen to fight in the army fell. And it was a case of either let the landlord get rich or the moneylender get rich and lose the kingdom, or behead the moneylender and keep the kingdom. It wasn't a really hard choice back then.
No. I mean, do you know what? I mean, there's a lot of references in the Bible, too, to this idea of debt slaves as well, and quite a lot of references to forgiving debt. So there's a precedent there. And in fact, in Lagash, in what is now Iraq, they found an inscription on the bricks of a temple, which is basically laying out the terms for cancellation of debt. So it's it's certainly not a new concept. It's obviously been seen for time immemorial that we do have to write debt off sometimes.
Yeah, people go and pray in church and say, "Forgive us our trespasses." I think the original term was actually "forgive us our debts." Yeah. I think it was too. So I mean, so there is a precedent set there. What of those people who haven't got debt, though? I mean, that's obviously if you start talking about a debt jubilee, and we'll talk about how you might apply it, there's going to be a lot of people, like your parents, who say, well, this isn't a problem for me. In fact, prices are being held down because of this debt issue. I'm quite happy where I am. Why should you be helping people who have, and I've seen arguments in your blogs from people leaving comments. Why should I be paying the price for people who have got themselves into this situation? Which is why I've sort of developed the extra argument saying, well, let's actually make it a modern debt jubilee, where rather than just freeing the debtors, you give everybody, given the government's money creation capability, everybody gets a cash injection, whether they're debtors or not. Those who are debtors get their debt paid down. Those that don't have debt get a cash injection. And that raises the next issue people have raised me. Well, what if that actually causes inflation? And I find that quite hilarious to some extent, because that's exactly what central banks have been trying to cause for the last 10 years and failing abjectly until very, very recently. But the other way that could be controlled would be if you use that money to buy shares, because particularly in the UK, the level of corporate debt is pretty much the same as the level of household debt. So if you just got rid of one, you're still going to be stuck with the other. And what I'm suggesting here is that if you get issued money through a modern debt jubilee and you don't have debt, then you have one choice, or potentially just one choice. You can make it more flexible than that, and that is that you have to pay down. You have to buy shares, which are used by the corporations that sell the shares to reduce corporate debt.
Right. But wouldn't you also be just causing an asset bubble in share prices, as potentially we're seeing in the United States at the moment?
Well, the asset bubble has been caused by the central banks themselves, and this is partly why I think there's actually probably more potential to argue this case than there was before they began quantitative easing. Because remember, the central banks were caught completely by surprise by the financial crisis. They had no idea it was coming. In fact, they thought 2008 was going to be a cracker year, and then it hits them. And what do they have as an avenue? The one thing they had previous experience was of Japan doing quantitative easing for 15, I would say 10 years before the crisis hit in America. And what quantitative easing was the central bank would buy bonds off the private banks. And by buying bonds off the private banks, not just short-term government bonds, which is the usual thing they do in what they call repurchase agreements, which they're doing all the time. The central bank would buy bonds right across the spectrum, and even started buying mortgage-backed securities. Now, what that meant was, you think of it in terms of a double entry, what's going on? The central bank says, here's $1 billion, whacks it into the bank account of, let's say, Chase Manhattan, and then Chase Manhattan says, oh, that's nice, here's $1 billion worth of our mortgage-backed securities, and that goes on the asset side of the central bank ledger. Now, what the central bank has done is effectively validated that debt and paid full price for it too. But that then means that the Chase Manhattan, or whatever it's called after the last merger, has $1 billion of cash and $1 billion less of income earning assets. So it uses that $1 billion to go and buy other assets, which are you're pretty hard buying bonds when the gorilla and the biggest gorilla in the family is buying all the government ones. So you go buy shares. And, well, who do you buy the shares of? You buy the people who own shares. And are they rich or poor?
Yeah.
Well, of course, they're rich. So what you had is a massive increase in inequality after the crisis caused by central banks.
Yeah.
And now what I'm arguing for QE for the people here in modern debt jubilee is let's reverse that. Let's then give money to on a per capita basis. So Rupert Murdoch gets the same amount as you do. And then if you don't have any debt, I think Rupert has got some debt.
Yeah.
If you get any debt, you pay your debt down by, say, 10,000 quid. But if you don't have debt, you've got to buy £10,000 worth of shares, which are then used by the company who receives them specifically to cancel their corporate debt. So you'd reduce the level of leverage in both the corporate sector and the household sector.
Right, but that leads me nicely onto the next question, because how much? So if you mention that figure of 10,000, let's take that as for example. I'd love 10,000 right now, but if I was to say, well, I'm going to put that towards a house, given the price of houses around here, that's not going to go very far for me. If I've got one of those houses and I'm racked in high debt, 10,000 isn't going to be very much either. It's going to make no difference to whether I'm going to default at some point or how much I'm having to pay in if interest rates go up. It's not enough. So it would have to be quite a substantial sum, wouldn't it? But if we look at UK household debt, it's about £1.6 trillion, which is about twice the amount the government spends every year. So if we wipe the slate clean, clearly that's way too much money. You mentioned inflation. You would certainly get that if you spent twice what the government spends in a year. You might actually have a problem with inflation at that point. So what's the order? So there's the two extremes. What's the order of magnitude?
Well, I actually worked it out while you were talking. Thank God for computer keyboards.
And thank God I take a long time to ask a question.
Oh, thank God you're long-winded. Absolutely.
Thanks.
And you're welcome. And looking at that, like if I said 10,000 per person in the UK, that's for 60 million is roughly the population?
Yeah.
Okay. Divide that by the last value of GDP, the UK GDP. If you gave 10,000 to every person, you'd be giving them 30% of GDP. Now, the current level of private debt in the UK, and it's the household sector, here we go, tapping on the microphone here. Current level of debt in the household sector is rising once more, and it's currently 88% of GDP. So you could reduce household debt by, let's say, half the people are debtors and half don't have debt. You'd reduce it from 87%, say, to 70%. That's still way above level it was back in 1980. To give people a picture for that, the level of household debt is, as I said, roughly 90% of GDP now. Back in 1980, it was 30% of GDP. So a long way to go. But that figure of 10,000 per person would reduce household debt by, say, 15%, 87 roughly down to, say, 70%. And then for the corporate sector, which is currently running at about 75% of GDP, it reduced that debt level to 60%.
Right, but you're averaging it all out, aren't you? I mean, there will be some people who are very heavy in debt, and there's some people who are, not in debt at all. And ironically, those people who are very heavy in debt are probably also very rich. They're certainly very asset rich, but they're the ones who can land themselves in the most trouble and do the most damage to the economy. So they're the ones you're going to have to help the most. And that's probably what people are going to have difficulty with. You're going to have people who don't have a lot of money saying, hang on a second, you're going to give me a slug of money, but you're also going to bail out, the rich people. But are you going to bail them out enough to get them out of trouble? But
I don't care about them macroeconomically. First of all, they're a trivial part of the population. Secondly, they don't spend anywhere near as much as the poor.
Well, okay, not the very rich, but the people who do have a high mortgage. So let's, I'm living in a part of the country where it's very difficult to buy anything that's worth less than £500,000.
Yeah,
and I'm surrounded by people who aren't really earning. I mean, earning more than the average probably for the country, but certainly not enough to compensate for the fact that house prices are very expensive. So they will be carrying heavy debt, and not necessarily what you'd call rich, just middle class people with heavy debt. You'd have to pay a lot to them to get them out of a difficult situation, for example, of interest rates to rise, and you wanted to ensure that they carried on spending, which is the whole idea behind this, isn't it?
Well, it's not so much that they're carrying on spending, it's reducing the extent to which the debt overhang means people don't take our credit in the first place. We don't have sufficient aggregate demand. But this is the sort of thing you need to analyse in a complex feedback system, put together a complex model, not the neoclassical DSGE load of garbage, but something that actually covers non-equilibrium dynamics and monetary flows, and then say, what is the impact, what is the hypothetical impact of doing this, and test it at various levels. So, like if I go, 10,000 was just an obviously round figure. If we imagine there's, say, 30 million bank accounts in the country, then you give £20,000, that's still 30% of GDP. You could start with something as low as £3,000 and see what happened, and then measure the impact. But a large part of this is trying to reduce the level of leverage behind financial assets, because a huge part of the price level of both houses and shares is the level of leverage people are taking out. And if you start reducing this leverage, and you also make policy changes to housing so that banks can't lend more than, and another part of my proposal is that they can't lend more than, say, 10 times the expected annual rental income of the property, then you would actually cause house prices to fall. Now, that is clearly going to have an issue for people who've got themselves highly levered and think they're extremely wealthy because of their overvalued houses caused by the leverage. If the leverage starts to fall, and this is talking about the marginal leverage too, it's the new level of new loans coming out, not the reducing the level of existing debt so much, but meaning that the level of new debt for housing would be substantially lower. House prices could fall quite dramatically. So you'd have quite a few things to try to balance in this whole policy. It would not be easy. But if we have a problem caused by too much private debt, and that's definitely the cause of the crisis and the cause of the slump afterwards, you've got to get it down. Yeah. And there's two options: either a debt jubilee, or we bomb the shit out of each other again in World War III.
I wish I could end it on that point, but I got a couple more questions, and one which I'm sure, because that was a great end. Love to end on a strong piece, but let's not do that, because I know one thing that people listening will be asking, and I'm sure you get asked this all the time, is just, and I've asked it, about the behaviour around banks. Doesn't it just reduce the risk? So if people know that every so often there's going to be a debt jubilee, won't they just return to their old ways? They'll just go, well, this is fine. The government's going to get me out of this down the track, so I don't need to worry about it too much.
Well, they're doing it already. I mean, this is the fact that Ireland's got a housing bubble again 5 years after it had a 50% house price slump, shows that, yes, they will go back to their old way of behaviour if that is still feasible. So you simply can't do it just by saying, here's a debt jubilee, have a party afterwards. You have to follow it up with a range of controls over the social privilege of being allowed to create money. And this is what, again, it's getting used to what money actually is. It's created by double entry bookkeeping. Once you have the right to use your double entry ledger to create money, you can do it. It's not rocket science by any stretch of imagination. In fact, it'd be better if we freed a few of the rocket scientists up from actually working banks to going back and making rockets again. What could go wrong though? I mean, if you did it, say you experimented and you said, yeah, well, let's do maybe £3,000 or £5,000, and I guess you're thinking, it's like the
impulse quantitative easing that we talked about before. The money just goes into your bank account and you feel that little bit wealthier. What could potentially go wrong with that approach?
Well, there could be a boost to imports. That's one obvious thing. A trade deficit could get worse.
Yeah. Which is arguably what happened in Australia, because money was, they sort of tried this to try and ease Australia through the global financial crisis. Money went into people's bank accounts at a time when, unfortunately, flat screen TVs were coming down in price. And anecdotally, everyone went to Harvey Norman and bought themselves a flat screen TV. So, yeah, the balance of trade wouldn't have been helped by that.
Yeah, and the other side is you're also likely to get an impact in terms of the value of the currency. That's likely to fall. Which counteracts to some extent the import process. If you did it on the scale I'm talking about, my target for the UK, for example, would be get it back to the level of debt it had for the last century before Maggie Thatcher, which is about 70% of GDP. Now it's currently running at about 180%. So that's a substantial fall over time. That would have to have impacts on the balance of trade, have to have impacts on value of the currency and so on. So you'd have to check all these things out in a simulation way, and you could also do it, as I say, on a test level, which I'd also like to do. That's what I'd like to see. One element in the budget, which I know is a zero chance of actually happening. So let's suggest it, and that's like a £1,000 test of this through what the Bank of England is developing right now, which they haven't yet implemented them, but they're looking at how it could be done. Digital bank accounts for everybody. So the reason that a debt jubilee hasn't been possible, except for things like the $1,000 per person back in Australia in 2008, is that the banks don't have a way of directly contacting individuals. That's why they go through the financial institutions. But if they set up the framework so everybody has a digital account at the Bank of England, which has one-for-one parity with the English pound, then they could use that. You'd be told if you withdraw the money from it, that has two uses. One is to pay down debt. The other is to buy shares from corporations, which themselves have to be used to pay down debt. So it's actually becoming more technically feasible now as well.
Yeah, well, I wonder though whether if you haven't got debt and you're sort of forcing the masses into the financial classes almost, aren't they? They have to learn about shares.
Well, again, this is something which I'm no great fan of the superannuation system in Australia, as you know, because a lot of it's gone into share market price speculation rather than into actually getting investment done by corporations. But again, if it was done in conjunction with another part of the process that said you have to buy shares which the corporations use to cancel debt, then you could, then in that case, you're reducing the debt burden on UK corporations. And again, that debt burden is far higher than it used to be. It's currently running us at 78% or 76% of GDP. Go back to 1980, just after Maggie elected, 24% of GDP. So you've had a trebling at the level of debt in the country. And this is over historical levels as well. So this is why I get pissed off with people spending so much of their bloody emotional energy on Brexit, not looking at credit, which is the real driver of the economy.
Well, yeah, okay. What about? I think Brexit's still an issue, though. But you and I beg to differ on that one. But look, is there an example of anywhere in the world where there's a government that's actually said, yeah, well, we have an issue with the household debt to GDP ratio, and we need to bring it down? Has any country anywhere in the world ever taken it as a policy objective?
Not yet. This would be, if it was done, it'd be the first time it was done.
And can it be done unilaterally? So could Britain say, well, okay, we're going to tackle this and we're going to issue a debt jubilee. No one else in the world's doing it. What could be the impact of that?
Well, again, I think you've got to look at if you actually set it up so that people had to buy shares, and the shares were then held like in a sense as a corporate investment over time. Which would mean that the people receiving dividends for the shares they purchased, then their spending level would be the dividend flow from the shares. It wouldn't be spend the entire amount of money. So the actual impact on the real economy in terms of changing demand levels could be quite slight. The real impact would be reducing the debt burden, and therefore meaning people have a higher capacity to spend than they have right now, where their disposable incomes are being squeezed by debt payments. So I've got a feeling, and I would want to test this. I want to do a very complicated Minsky non-equilibrium monetary model to look at what all the implications could be. But I think the overall implications could be giving corporations more room to consider investing, where at the moment they're basically buying their own shares back and rewarding themselves with dividends. We could start definancialising the economy, and that is desperately necessary because so-called neoliberal period was really massive increase in private debt period, which financialised the economy. And finance is a great servant and a lousy master. We've got to turn it back into a servant again, and that is fundamentally the only way you do that is by reducing its claims on the real economy, which is by reducing private debt.
But if you allow somebody to pay off debt, they use that money to pay off debt. You'd have to also say, well, you can't then, having paid off that debt, go and take out debt with to buy another house, and
which is why I want to put limits on the amount of lending that banks can do. Because again, what we have. The reason we had a crisis in the first place, in many ways, is the sheer stupidity of economic theory, which completely ignored the financial sector and treated the financial sector as exogenous to the economy. And they're now trying to model it as exogenous shocks. I mean, it's a bit of news to most people who aren't economists that the financial sector is not part of the economy. But with that ignorance, we just walk blindly into this trap. You look at the data, and particularly the UK data, just screams there's something bad going on here, and they ignored it from 1980 on, this accelerating level of private debt. So if we hadn't had that stupidity, we wouldn't be in this situation.
So just to end on a strong point, then, we've got a choice, haven't we? We've got a choice of two things. One is that we can try and reduce this debt. What's the alternative? I
think stumbling on with the level we're at right now.
No. We bomb the living daylights out of each other. That was the strong point, remember?
That's the bomb the living daylights out of each other is one possibility, but we know we're not going to do that in the Third World War. As I think Einstein was once asked, what would be the weaponry used in the Third World War? And he said, I don't know what the Third World War will be fought with, but the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones.
All right, look, next time, foreign ownership, is it good or bad? Should we allow foreign companies or foreign individuals to own our houses or our companies or our farmland? Yeah. Where should we draw the line? We'll talk about that next time. Till now, thanks for your time.
Okay.
That's Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and that was the Debunking Economics podcast. We'll see you next time.